Welcome to Chapter 2. We're talking in this chapter about early globalization and a time period that most people generally do associate with the forming of America in general, starting with 1492 and going all the way through 1650. And here's your handy timetable. You can see exactly what we're going to be looking at in this chapter, starting with Christopher Columbus in 1492, and we'll go all the way through the Dutch founding New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, and then we'll pick up there in Chapter 3. Christopher Columbus, after he discovered the New World, sent letters home to Spain to tell all about the wonders that he saw. These letters were quickly circulated throughout Europe and then translated even into Italian, German, and Latin languages. The picture here is of a woodcut from the first Italian verse translation of the letter Columbus sent to the Spanish court after his first voyage. So it was the Portuguese that really initiated exploration, which started in the 1400s. And Prince Henry, or Henry the Navigator, is the one who is really kind of known for starting exploration. It didn't start with Columbus. So Henry the Navigator wanted to find Prester John. Now, if you're watching the video, obviously you can't click the link that's included on the slides. But if you open up the attached slides in your course module, you'll be able to click there to read a little more about Prester John. Basically, Prester John was a missionary who went to spread the word of God and kind of create a little settlement. And he went missing. No one heard from him again. So there were rumors and legends about this community or what had happened to them. So Henry the Navigator wanted to do that. He wasn't out looking for spices or money. He was looking to find the settlement or the congregation of Prester John. Henry the Navigator, in his exploration, was able to develop a trade route. By successfully navigating east to Africa, this gave Portugal a foothold in that region, and most importantly, it spurred the idea of exploration in general. Unfortunately, we could say, this introduced Portuguese to African slave trade. Now, African slave trade was already a business at this time. Okay, so people were already involved in the slave trade when the Portuguese arrived in Africa. So the Portuguese didn't necessarily go to Africa and say, we're going to take these people prisoners and they're going to be slaves from here on. They didn't invent slave trade, that's what I'm trying to say. It was already a thing. It was already a business. The Portuguese did, however, use slaves because they had sugar plantations on the islands that they had claimed in the Atlantic. And slavery continued to expand as exploration expanded. Now, in terms of Spanish exploration, it was the Spanish who established the first European settlements in the Americas. And we're not talking about in America proper, like we know it today or like we refer to it. We're talking about the Caribbean. And by 1600, they were establishing settlements in Central and South America. So you know about Columbus. He was funded by the Spanish, but Columbus was actually Italian. They also had Cortez and Pizarro as big explorers for Spain. Spain wanted to gain advantage over Portugal in the 15th century, and the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella was the very first step. The union of Ferdinand and Isabella was important for a lot of reasons. First of all, Ferdinand was from the country known as Aragon. Now, if we were in the classroom, you'd probably hear me call it Arendelle because, Disney has invaded my brain. But anyway, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. So those were both two very large countries in and of their own within Spain. And so by marrying, those countries were united. It was a super large territory. And we know that with power, or with land, comes power. So they had a very large kingdom. It's also important because since the 700s, Spain was Islamic. So Ferdinand and Isabella were Catholic. And now suddenly their marriage means that they have the largest territory there. They wanted to beat the Muslims in Granada, and Granada was the last remaining Islamic stronghold. In 1492, they did beat Granada in what is called the Reconquista. It took 781 years to complete. Okay, so obviously they didn't see it through. They started it, they didn't see it through. And Reconquista means reconquest. They went back to take something. Their goals as king and queen of Spain, their goals were to expand Catholicism and to beat Portugal in trade. So when I was a kid, I was taught that Columbus discovered America and that he named it for his good buddy, Amerigo Vespucci. So, kind of made sense, right? Except if it were me, I would have named it after myself instead of my buddy, but maybe Columbus was better than that. So, the truth of the matter is that they were both contemporaries, they were both Italians. However, Columbus sailed for Spain, and Vespucci actually sailed on behalf of Portugal. So they were both Italian, and they were exploring for other countries. So what really happened here is that a German map maker gave the name America to his world map that he was making in 1507. So there was no, hey, this is my buddy, I'm going to name it for him. It was just a random German map maker who said, yeah, we'll call it America. So anyway, 1507. In 1504, Cortez was a Spaniard, and he was an explorer who overtook the Aztecs in 1521. We talk a little about Cortez and about how the fact that he was European, the Aztecs didn't kill him right away because they felt like these Europeans were maybe gods. And we talk about that a lot in Civilization. So you may have heard that if you've already had Civilization through the 16th century or Civilization since the 16th century. But anyway, Pizarro, also a Spaniard who brought about the fall of the Incan Empire. And Coronado, another Spaniard who looked for riches in the southwestern part of the United States, or what is now the United States, and he ended up bankrupt. This map shows what is now the American Southwest. It shows the Coronado expedition through there from 1540 to 1542. And, so he crosses the American Southwest and the Great Plains, and he came here thinking that these regions were just large, vast, empty land that were waiting to be discovered, waiting for him to come claim. But what he found was that there were people living there. There were natives living there. So here's where we start jumping around a little bit, just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on in Europe so that you can understand the culture of things that are happening there that lead to development here. Martin Luther was a German Catholic monk who fought the practice of selling indulgences. He also fought against taxation and objected to the Latin Mass. Now, the selling of indulgences, let me explain that just a little bit. At the particular time, the Catholic Church was selling kind of like a get out of hell free card. Okay, so if you were concerned that your departed loved one might be suffering in purgatory, then you could pay money to the church to have them kind of like pushed to the front of the line so that they could get into heaven faster. Martin Luther said, this is not biblical, and this is wrong. You're taking advantage of people. You're using scare tactics to make them fear, and then you're taking their money. So that's what indulgences refers to. It's not like, they were having a bake sale and selling chocolate. We indulge on chocolate. Not the same thing. The reason he objected to Latin Mass was because few people at that time could understand it. He's a German monk, so his language, the local vernacular that everyone used, would be German. So he felt like church should be taught in the language that it could be best understood. And he called for reform. And because he was protesting the Catholic Church, he was called a Protestant, right? A Protestant. And he was asking for reform. So that's where we get the name Protestant Reformation. Now remember, Martin Luther is a Catholic monk. He did not want to start a new religion. He just wanted to fix what he saw that was bad. He felt like it needed to be repaired. But instead, Lutheranism developed as a separate Protestant religion. And it wasn't just in Germany that people were calling for change. John Calvin was actually a French lawyer who urged that the Bible needed to be public, not just something that was read from by a priest at church. He really promoted the idea of self-Bible study. So he left Catholic France and moved to Switzerland, which was more open as far as religious opportunities went. And through this move, he ended up developing the principles of what we know as Calvinism. Calvinism taught that humans are powerless, that God has predestined them to what they will be. He also taught that God selects just a few to be saved and the rest get damnation. However, reading scripture was your prep work. So even though you had been predestined to go to heaven, you needed to read scripture in case you made it there. If you didn't make it there, then, what's it going to hurt? So that was kind of the principle of it. And Calvinism then starts to spread to the Netherlands and Scotland. A couple of important things happened for Protestantism in England. The first one was in 1526. William Tyndale translated the Bible into English. He was an English scholar, and so he made that translation. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII established Protestantism as the state religion. So let's talk a little about Henry VIII. Now, he had been a devout Catholic. As a matter of fact, when the Protestant Reformation was getting underway, he was even once called the defender of the faith. He wrote these declarations and letters about how strong the church was. And things changed for him, though, because the religion didn't meet his needs at one point. He wanted a male heir to carry on the throne. His wife, Catherine, did not give birth to a son, so he sought annulment. But the Pope refused to give an annulment. So that's when Henry VIII started the Church of England. He just started his own church. Then he married his wife, Anne Boleyn, and when she didn't have a male, she was executed for adultery. So the thing about the Anne Boleyn marriage is that she had been married to his brother, and in order for them to marry, she had to have not consummated that marriage with her husband. And so the king says, I'm sure she didn't, I know she didn't, I know for a fact she didn't. And so the marriage was allowed. So when she didn't have a male, he says, you know, found out that she did actually consummate the marriage with my brother. So he was allowed to divorce her, but he executed her. Jane Seymour finally gave him his son Edward, but he died at age 15. And at that point, Bloody Mary, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine, was able to take the throne and restore Catholicism. If you like this part of history, there is a book called The Last Tudor, Tudor, The Last Tudor, that is really interesting, and it's about this exact period in history. Obviously, it's like I call it creative nonfiction because it recreates conversations that there's no way we could know, but it is based on diary findings and stuff that they have. And it's really interesting about the fight for the throne when Edward dies before Mary takes over. There's actually someone else crowned in between. Anyway, the book is called The Last Tudor, if you're interested in it. When Mary took the throne, Bloody Mary, as she would be known, she restored the throne to Catholicism. Remember, her father, Henry VIII, started the Church of England. Bloody Mary comes in and restores Catholicism. So when Elizabeth, who would be Mary's half-sister, takes the throne in 1558, she returned it to the Church of England, but kept many of the Catholic rituals. And that was kind of her way of offering a religious tolerance of sorts. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and she wanted to kind of bridge a gap there. And so there was a degree of religious tolerance during the reign of Elizabeth at that point. However, this is what initiates the Puritans. They want more reforms. They want to see a complete end to Catholicism. And so over the years, people have gone back and forth. The people of England, they were Catholic, they were Church of England, they were Catholic, now they're Protestant Church of England again. And, it's really kind of hard to keep up with. The Puritans don't want any connection to the Catholic Church at all. And these people who were known as Puritans, this was not a nice term at all. I mean, it was kind of like degrading. They were seen as blasphemers by some people. And by the early 1500s, Protestantism was a threat to Catholicism. Spain very much wanted to protect the Catholic Church. Remember, the largest area had been Muslim for so long. And so Ferdinand and Isabella returned it to Catholicism. Spanish King Philip sought to take over Protestant England and Holland because they wanted to keep Spain Catholic. So they wanted to take over England and Holland in order to reinforce their strength. However, the English Navy was really strong and they defeated the Spanish Armada. So Queen Elizabeth was the queen at the time we had a lot of exploration going on, and England just simply did not have the money to get into it. Exploring costs money. So Elizabeth kind of found a loophole in order to explore, and what she did was she permitted these privateers, and privateers were sea captains who had government permission to raid the enemy at will. So these privateers, a better word for it would actually be pirates. So these Queen-approved pirates were able to rob Spain of about $130,000 each year. And in 1573, Francis Drake looted $52,000. A lot of money back then for sure. So by doing this, people are, seeing these benefits in exploring of sorts. So Elizabeth then decides to send an attempt at colonization of the New World. This is in 1584. She sends Sir Walter Raleigh to an area off the coast of North Carolina known as Roanoke. And it was a tough time, obviously, but John White was the Roanoke governor, and he went back to England for supplies, returned 3 years later. 3 years, yes, 3 years, not 3 months, 3 days, 3 weeks, but 3 years later, the colony was gone. Now, there's still a mystery about what happened to the colony of Roanoke. It's really interesting. You'll have to Google that sometime. When you have a little extra time, there are documentaries out there everywhere that are really interesting. So England wanted very much to be part of exploration and colonization of this new world, but without the money to do it, they had to find other ways to get people to want to go. So English promoters told them about all of the commercial advantages that it could have. You could go there and you could become your own person. You could, have your own business. You could, of course, everything's got to be developed. They leave that part out. The other thing is that they tell them they could create a Protestant America. So in the early 1600s, English merchants and wealthy people start to pull their resources together to form joint stock companies like investors or corporations. And they then are able to send people to establish the first permanent English settlement, which is Jamestown. The problem was obviously disease from the bad water, war, and famine. English also settled in the West Indies during this time, and they had commercial products like tobacco and sugar that they grew. Barbados was the first colony dependent on slaves, the first English colony dependent on slaves. This is a painting of Elizabeth I of England, painted in about 1588, and it shows the Queen with her hand on a globe, and that kind of signifies her power that she has over the world. And the pictures in the background show the English defeat of the Spanish Armada. So this painting in and of itself is more than just a portrait. It's very symbolic. Also, when you get to Chapter 3, I want you to compare this picture to the picture of Pocahontas and note some of the similarities and what they could possibly mean. So when we're little kids and we talk about this part in history, we always tend to focus on the Pilgrims or the Puritans. We don't look at them as the same people, but they are. It's just that the Pilgrims were the first group of Puritans. So they were on a pilgrimage. Okay. The Pilgrims started in the Netherlands. They left England and went to the Netherlands so that they could have this religious freedom, but what they saw was that their kids were developing the culture of the Netherlands, and so they didn't want that. They decided they wanted their children to very much keep their English culture, so that was their reason for moving to what is now, America or the U.S. in 1620. So the Pilgrims insisted on separating from the Church of England, and they are separatist in that way. The Puritans in 1630 started Massachusetts Bay Colony, and England still wasn't comparable to Spain at this point in either exploration or colonization. So while we tend to think that, England had great explorers and they sent people here to colonize, that's not exactly how it happened. And I think we have that outlook because we're here. It's our history, so we kind of add to it, and maybe we've been told a little more than was really there. But it's important to know that at this point, England is still not comparable to Spain in terms of exploration. The French were exploring too. Cartier explored from 1534 to 1541 by making 3 voyages to North America and claimed the area that we now know as Canada for France, and he called it New France. Now, this did not result in great riches, one, because the land itself, and two, was because of the fight from natives. He just could not establish a permanent settlement there. And Champlain explored the Caribbean in 1601. Then he founded Quebec in 1608. Now, Champlain developed great relationships with the natives, which was really helpful in establishing a French trade stronghold. And that was his main goal, trade. And now on to the Dutch. In terms of Dutch exploration, the Dutch East India Company in 1602 established trade in Asia. The Dutch West India Company in 1621 established trade in the Americas. And Henry Hudson, while he was looking for a northwest passage to Asia, found ample furs instead and founded New Amsterdam, which is now what we know as New York. In terms of the way work got done in the U.S., or what is now the U.S., there were a couple of different ways. The natives were used for labor systems, and we'll talk more about that in Chapter 3, but the idea was you work and we give you religion in return. Whether that was Catholicism, as noted in your slides, Catholicism would have been the trade for the French and the Spanish, but the English, bringing with them Protestantism and their different ideas. So, you work and we give you our religious notions, and, obviously disregarding the fact that the natives had their own religion to begin with. Also, the labor system of African slaves, which was we bought you so you work. The New World commerce was mercantilism, and that's the economic theory that nations should control trade with their colonies to ensure a favorable trade balance. So that wraps up our look at Chapter 2. I know this was fast. I know it's jumped around a lot, but it's just to give you a background of everything that's going on at this particular time while the U.S. is just beginning to see colonization, or what will become the U.S., obviously. Once we get through this part, and this in Chapter 3, the U.S. history part starts to roll around rather congruently, so it's not hard to keep up with. So after this, you'll move on to Chapter 3.